Hello, and welcome to the presentation on Judith Jarvis Thomson's pro-choice argument. As mentioned in the previous presentation, Thomson will be giving an unusual pro-choice argument, and probably one that you are unfamiliar with. While most pro-choice arguments surround a debate regarding the personhood status of the fetus, Thomson is going to argue that even if we start with the assumption that a fetus, or even a single-celled zygote, is a full-fledged person, though she does not truly believe it is, abortion can be justified in many circumstances. An important note about thought experiments. You should have read the section in the FAQ about thought experiments for this class, but it bears repeating here because Thomson is a master of thought experiments, even in the hollowed halls of philosophy. In fact, her violinist thought experiment that we will be discussing here is very famous. But it is going to seem strange. Many students react to thought experiments in philosophy by pointing out that they are unrealistic, that they are situations that will never happen in reality. This misses the point. The point of thought experiments in philosophy is much the same as the point of empirical experiments in the sciences. They are not meant to be realistic, they are meant to isolate variables. In science, variables are isolated so that the effects of changing particular factors can be empirically measured. In philosophy, variables are isolated so that the effects of changing those specific variables can be tested against our intuitions, or so that important implications can be noted. Both in the sciences and in philosophy, this leads to unrealistic experiments. For example, suppose that you were a behavior scientist and wanted to test how temperature affected behavior. You might put one group of mice in a cage and keep them at 100 degrees Fahrenheit. You might keep another group of mice in a cage as a control group and keep them at 72 degrees. You would then record all incidents of aggression in the mice in the two environments to see what the differences are. But in order for this to work, you have to keep all other variables in the cages as identical as possible. Your experiment would be ruined if you kept more mice in one cage than in the other, or if you fed one group of mice plenty of food but starved the other, or fed one group of mice one type of food but fed another a different type. For the best possible experiment, you would keep all variables but temperature as identical as possible. You would turn the lights on and off at the same times of day, you would feed them exactly the same diet and the same amounts, you would give them the same amount of water or allow them to drink as much as they wanted, and so forth. You might even use two groups of genetically identical mice. It is important to note how unrealistic this scenario is. In real life, that is to say in the wild, one is never going to run across two groups of genetically identical mice being exposed to environmental conditions that are exactly the same in all ways except for temperature. But you seldom hear people object to science experiments by saying, "That's so unbelievable, that would never happen in real life." Philosophers are up to much the same thing when they ask you to imagine two people stranded on a desert island, or when they ask you to imagine an intelligent alien race like us in all ways except that they are incapable of feeling anger, or ask us to imagine a machine that can simulate human experiences so exactly that you can't tell if you're inside the experience machine or in real life. If you object to these thought experiments with the objection that this is never going to happen, then you are likely missing the point in just the same way that you would be if you objected to the mouse experiment by pointing out that two groups of mice are likely never going to live under identical conditions except for temperature. The point is to keep as many variables as steady as possible so that the philosopher can test our intuitions or reasoning regarding a particular variable that may be important. That said, let's move on. Back to Thomson. As previously noted, Thomson's argument is going to be a bit unusual. Thomson points out that most arguments about abortion deal with the personhood status of the fetus. Marquis noted this as well. Thomson notes that opponents of abortion spend most of their time trying to establish that a fetus is a person. They seem to think, she says, that if a fetus is a person, that it would just be obvious that abortion is wrong. Thomson disagrees. She does not believe that this conclusion is obvious at all. In other words, she believes that there is still an explanatory gap, that the anti-abortionists skip over between the personhood of a fetus and the immorality of abortion. So, while Thomson in reality disagrees that an early-term fetus or zygote is in fact a person, that is to say that she really does not think that these things are full-fledged persons, she is going to assume that they are persons for the sake of argument in order to try to show that, even if she grants anti-abortionists their assumption, she can still show that abortion is defensible in many circumstances. So here's Thomson's basic project. She's going to assume arguendo that personhood occurs at the moment of conception. To assume something arguendo means to assume something for the sake of argument. That is to say, she's going to grant the pro-life side their premise, even though she doesn't truly agree with it, to see how far their argument can go. Now, supposing that the pro-life side is correct on the issue, the personhood of the fetus issue, she asks, how is their argument supposed to go from there? She offers up one possibility. It might go something like this. Every person has a right to life, so the fetus has a right to life. No doubt the mother has a right to decide what shall happen to her body. Everyone would grant that. But surely a person's right to life is stronger and more stringent than a mother's right to decide what happens in and to her body, and so outweighs it. So the fetus may not be killed. Abortion may not be performed. So this is going to be her basic strategy. She's going to try to undermine the pro-life movement's usually implicit argument that she tried to make explicit in the last page. That is to say, assume that a zygote is a person, although she does not believe that it is at this early stage herself, and then try to show that it is not impermissible to take away the life of an innocent in particular situations that will be analogous to abortions. She's going to try to do this by making arguments by analogy. These analogies will take the form of some very odd thought experiments. As we mentioned, it is important to note that even though these thought experiments are unlikely to ever happen in real life, the point of them is to test our moral intuitions regarding the pro-life movement's argument that if personhood is granted at conception, abortion is wrong. So, here is the first thought experiment. Suppose that one day you're walking alone. You feel somebody's hand wrap around your face and you wake up from a total blackout in a hospital attached to a famous violinist with a medical device attaching the two of you and your blood going into his body. The doctors say, "We're sorry about this situation. We would have never allowed it to have happened, and even the violinist is innocent. Crazed members of the Music Lovers Society have acted on their own and left you hooked here together. But since unplugging you from the violinist would be killing him, you are going to have to stay hooked up to him for 9 months, after which time he will be cured. His right to life is more important than your right to do with what you want with your body." Note the important details of the situation here. Both the violinist and the doctor are innocent. The violinist has nothing to do with your kidnapping. Neither did the doctor. The violinist wouldn't have endorsed the kidnapping, but now that it has happened, he does not want to die. The doctor is saying that she or he doesn't have a right to unhook you from the violinist because if she does so, the violinist will die. Thomson is asking you to put yourself in the place of the man or woman who has been kidnapped by the Society of Music Lovers in order to save the violinist. Really pause a moment and try to imagine yourself in this situation. You have been kidnapped, knocked out, and wake up hooked to this stranger and are told that you must stay hooked up to this person for 9 months or he will die. Do you have a moral duty to stay hooked up to this person? Feel free to pause the presentation here and think about the situation. I will count down from 5. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. So Thomson is asking you the following question. Do you have a moral duty to stay hooked up to the violinist? It is important to understand the question here. She is not asking you if it would be morally nice for you to stay hooked up to him. She grants that it is. She is not asking if it would be a good thing for you to do so. It might be. She is asking you if you should be morally required to stay hooked up for 9 months to the stranger in the bed next to you. Do you think that it would be morally correct to use the law, for example, to force you to stay hooked up to this man for 9 months? Again, please feel free to pause this lecture for a moment and really think about this. Again, I will count down from 5 so that you can do this. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. What was your answer? Most people say that they are not morally obligated to stay hooked up to the violinist. Many might agree that it would be wonderfully nice to stay hooked up to him in order to save his life, much like it would be nice to donate bone marrow or donate an organ. But most people think that this is supererogatory. That is to say that it might be a good thing to do, but that it is not morally required, and also that the law should not force a person to stay hooked up. Of course, the mere fact that most people think something doesn't make it true. But remember, the purpose of this thought experiment is to test your intuitions while keeping all other variables the same. All other variables compared to what? Well, this is an argument from analogy. This thought experiment is meant to be an analogy to abortion. As it stands now, it represents cases of abortion where pregnancy was the result of rape. Why? Because the kidnapped man or woman didn't volunteer to be hooked up to the violinist. It was done to her or him completely against her or his will. What does Thomson think that we should think about this case? Thomson thinks it should be fairly clear that the violinist has no claim on the kidnapped person's body. Even though the violinist is an innocent and she or he did not know about the Society of Music Lovers plan, just like a zygote or fetus would be an innocent person if we grant that they are people, that innocence does not give him or her a right to an innocent kidnapping victim's body. If you agree with this in the violinist case, then, if Thomson was successful in holding all the relevant variables steady, we will consider possible objections later, a zygote or fetus does not have a right to an innocent rape victim's body either. So to sum up, Thomson is essentially saying that if you agree that a person will have a right to unplug herself or himself from the violinist, then, at the very least, to be consistent, you have to support a woman's right to an abortion in the cases of rape. Her claim is that the moral issue in the two cases are analogous. The violinist is an innocent who wants to keep on living. The person the violinist is hooked up to is in the current situation as the result of the use of force by a third party. While I am not trying to convince you that Thomson is right, it is important to fully consider her argument. So, this would be another good time to pause and see if you agree that the kidnapped person should be able to free herself or himself from the violinist. If the analogy is good for women who are pregnant as a result of rape, then does this show that a woman should have a right to an abortion in such cases? Feel free to pause to think about this. At this point, Thomson believes that she has shown that a woman is morally justified in having an abortion in the case of rape. Then she asks, can those in the pro-life movement make an exception in the case of rape? Thomson says they can. They could say a person has a right to life only if they didn't come into existence because of rape, or they can say that all persons have a right to life, but that some have less of a right to life than others, in particular those who came into existence because of rape. But Thomson here says that these answers have a rather unpleasant sound, and that surely the question of whether you have a right to life at all, or how much of it you have, shouldn't turn on the question of whether or not you were the product of rape. Indeed, members of the pro-life movement who are against abortion even in the case of rape say that rape should not make a difference for just this reason. The same would be true if it is a troubled pregnancy and the woman would have to spend all 9 months in a hospital bed. In fact, she notes that some will not even make an exception when the woman's life will be shortened as a result of pregnancy, although such cases are now unusual and many in the pro-life movement do not accept that view anymore. While the previous version of the violinist thought experiment was designed only to be analogous to rape, the thought experiment is easily changeable to test our intuitions about abortion in other situations as well. So let's change the situation a bit to do this. Imagine the situation as before. The person who is kidnapped and hooked to the violinist is taken against her or his will. But in this case, imagine that the person who is kidnapped has heard about what the Society of Music Lovers has been doing in the news. She or he knows that they have been kidnapping people to save famous musicians. Nevertheless, the city has millions of people in it, and this has happened just a few times from what she or he has heard in the news. In fact, she or he judges the chances of being kidnapped and hooked up to the famous musician to be much like the odds of getting into a car accident while driving, and people still drive all the time. Nevertheless, in order to be extra careful, she or he carries a can of pepper spray, and she only walks in well-lit areas. In spite of these precautions, the man or woman does go out knowing that there is some risk of being kidnapped. And this person suffers from bad luck. She or he happens to get kidnapped and hooked up to the violinist just as in the situation before. All the other facts about the case can stay the same. The violinist isn't in on the music lover's plans but wants to stay alive, and so forth. Does the fact that the man or woman knew that there was some danger of being kidnapped mean that the hospital and police should force her to stay plugged into the violinist for 9 months against her will? Pause the lecture and think about this question before moving on. I will pause for a 5 count so that you have a chance to do this. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. If there is a change in your position, it would seem to have to be because the kidnapped person knew that there were risks, even though she or he took precautions such as pepper spray and stayed in well-lit areas to avoid it happening. The argument is that, while the other case is analogous for abortion in the cases of rape, this case is analogous to abortion in the case where contraception, maybe even double protection, was carefully used. So the argument is that if you think that one would still have the right to unplug herself or himself from the violinist, and if the analogy is good, then a woman who tried not to get pregnant but gets pregnant by bad luck should have a right to an abortion. Of course, even with the example expanded as it was in the last page, this doesn't cover the majority of abortions. Most abortions are not performed on people who are very careful with protection, such as using condoms and the pill, etc. So, this argument probably hasn't gotten Thomson where she wants to be yet. Nevertheless, if one accepts her arguments, and if her analogies work, she has opened up a pretty wide door for the abortion option, even if it is assumed that the fetus is a person. Can the door be pushed open further? That's what we will see next. Let us see if we can alter the thought experiment to broaden it one more time. The case is exactly the same as before, except instead of carrying a can of pepper spray, the kidnapped individual is a bit foolhardy this time. She or he isn't doing anything wrong by going out at night, and she or he isn't deliberately trying to get taken by the Society of Music Lovers, even though it is known they are out roaming the streets. The victim this time doesn't take pepper spray or stay in lit areas. Instead, the victim decides that her behavior isn't going to be controlled by fear of the Music Lovers Society. So when this person goes out, she or he takes her normal shortcut through an alley to save 10 minutes off her walk. As mentioned, she doesn't take pepper spray or a weapon with her. The result is the same as in the previous cases. She ends up getting kidnapped and hooked up to the violinist as before. So what are your intuitions about this altered case? If you were kidnapped by the Society of Music Lovers and hooked up to a violinist partially as a result of being careless, walking through a dark alley, should you be forced by the law, the hospital, and police to stay hooked up to the violinist for 9 months? If you said no before but yes now, then would you also say that you share responsibility if you were assaulted in a dark alley in the case of a mugging? In other words, are you partially responsible for being mugged? If you were robbed in a dark alley that you could have avoided, do you still deserve to have your property returned by the police? The argument would be that this case is analogous to a case where a woman doesn't want to get pregnant, but isn't very careful about protection. Maybe she allows the use of a condom that is too old, or if it is not hers, doesn't check the quality. Or maybe she was using her cycle as a method to prevent pregnancy. Or maybe she was on the pill but forgot a day or two. Perhaps birth control was even forgotten, though she still does not want to get pregnant in this case. And most unprotected sex acts do not end in pregnancy statistically. So, if you agree that the man or woman, the victim in this case, would have a right to unplug herself or himself from the violinist, the argument is that, if the analogy is good, a woman should be able to get an abortion even if the pregnancy is a result of not very careful or misconception. If one still agrees that one has a right to unplug oneself from the violinist, the argument has now been expanded to include most cases of abortion. So, what are your intuitions about the altered cases? One objection might be that the cases are disanalogous because having sex isn't as important as going out of one's house is. But it was never said in these cases where the person was going when you formed your intuitions. The person might be going out for a nice dinner or dancing or just going outside for the sake of a walk. Many of these things are just for the sake of entertainment. Another objection might be that the cases are different because sex or sex outside of marriage is morally wrong. But in that case, the pro-life movement would need to argue that sex for enjoyment, or sex outside of marriage, or sex not for the sake of procreation, or whatever position they happen to take, is morally wrong. Their argument would have to rest primarily on this, and not on the wrongness of abortion. But they want to argue that abortion itself is wrong. Here is an even stranger thought experiment that Thomson uses to indicate that it could be okay to kill an innocent in order to save one's own life. Thomson asks you to imagine a woman trapped in a house with a rapidly growing baby. This is a sci-fi type example. We are talking about a very tiny house and a very rapidly growing baby. A baby growing to gargantuan proportions right before her eyes. The baby is growing so large and so fast that it will eventually fill the house and crush the woman, and the only way for the woman to save her own life would be to kill the baby in order to stop it from growing. If she does not kill the baby, it will eventually grow so large that it will burst out of the house. The baby will be okay, but the woman would be crushed to death. The woman cannot escape the house, and the house belongs to the woman. Is it permissible for the woman to kill the baby to save herself? What do you think? Feel free to pause the presentation to think about this. I will count down from 5 to give you a moment to do so. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. But even if it is established that the woman has a right to kill the baby in the previous example, Thomson points out that there is another question. A person might have a right to kill the baby in the previous example, or unplug herself from the violinist in the earlier examples, but that does not mean that it is morally permissible for a third party, such as a doctor, to do so. So the next question that needs to be asked is whether or not it is permissible for a third party to act on behalf of the person who has a right to unplug or abort. So, in order to test our intuitions here, consider the same situation that we were just considering. We have the rapidly growing sci-fi baby in the tiny house about ready to crush the woman. But this time the woman can't kill the baby herself. It's too big. Luckily, there is a police officer passing by who sees what's happening through a window. The woman calls out to the police officer and quickly explains what's happening. So the question is this: does the police officer have the right or even the duty to kill the baby in order to save the woman? Thomson asks us to keep in mind that the house belongs to the woman. What do you think? Again, I will give you a 5 count. 5, 4, 3, 2, and... Though this is a strange thought experiment, she is using it to introduce another important argument. It is important because many people in the pro-life movement make the argument that even if a woman does have a right to an abortion to save her life, a third party does not have a right to do the abortion. In other words, she would somehow have to do it herself. If the police officer can shoot the baby to save the woman, the implication is that an abortion doctor could abort a fetus to save the woman. Of course, the analogy here is to an abortion where the pregnancy would kill the woman, but the scenario could be changed. Maybe the growing baby would just severely injure the woman or cause her a lot of pain. Remember, the woman cannot live outside the house and did not invite or deliberately take the baby in. Could the police officer still morally act to save the woman this pain by killing the baby? Again, important for Thomson's argument is that it is the woman's house. And if the house is the woman's body in the analogy, she can't just leave. Admittedly, the rapidly growing baby thought experiment is a bit weird. So perhaps this next argument might make the same point in a more intuitive way. Suppose that a group of people are at a restaurant when a cold snap hits. Without proper protection, the weather would kill a person. One person, person A, brought a coat warm enough to survive. Another person, person B, manages to find and put on A's coat before A can get to the coat rack. Both person A and person B need the coat to survive. Surely, Thomson argues, that the person who owns the coat has a right to it over the person who does not, who just happened to get to it first. But suppose that he or she cannot take it back by him or herself. Would a third party or police officer be allowed to give the coat back to the proper owner? Would it be moral? Thomson thinks that our intuitions would be yes. The analogy she sees here is that in the case of abortion, both the fetus and the woman need the woman's body, but it is the woman's body, and so she has a right to it, and others, such as a doctor who performs abortions, have a right to help her retain it. There's one more thought experiment to consider, and this is probably the strangest of them all. Thomson asks us to imagine that human biology is different. Instead of reproducing as we do now, imagine that human beings automatically create spores that float around in the air. These spores are such that they will float around until they land on a piece of furniture or carpeting, in which case they will become fertilized and germinate, and begin to grow into a human baby. You can imagine that when it does so, it is a significant burden on the homeowner. Maybe it drains electricity, screams all the time, causes appliances not to work, and so forth. Suppose you leave the door open and a spore flies into your house you own and begins to grow there. Should you be forced to leave it be for 9 months, or are you morally permitted to get rid of it? What if you had put up special screens to keep the spores out, but one got in anyways? What if you usually used the screen, but kept it past its warranty date, and a spore got in? What if you forgot to fully close the screen? What if somebody else cut through your screen and put a spore into your house? In these cases, do you think that you should be forced to allow the spore to germinate to full term? What would you say in those cases? Hopefully you can see the analogies to abortion. Suppose you leave the door open and a spore flies into a house you own and begins to grow there. Should you be forced to leave it for 9 months, or are you morally permitted to get rid of it? The abortion analogy here is to risky behavior, using no or little protection. What if you had put special screens up to keep the spores out, but one got in anyways? This is analogous to abortion in the case of careful contraception. What if you usually used the screen, but kept it past its warranty date? Or what if you forgot to fully close the screen? This is analogous to abortion when contraception was used, but not carefully. What if somebody else cut through your screen and put the spore into your house? This is analogous to a case of abortion as a result of rape or trickery. What do you think about these cases? Is one obligated to allow the spore to grow? Okay, we have now covered Thomson's primary thought experiments. Just as we did with Marquis, it is now time to consider some possible objections to her piece. The 5 primary objections to her argument are: first, a pregnancy is natural, while being hooked up to a violinist is unnatural life support. Second, that there is a difference of degree. Being hooked up to the violinist is somehow worse than being pregnant, so the analogy is faulty. Third, the question of whether or not a conjoined twin should be able to separate himself or herself from the other if it means that the other will die, then to claim that this would be immoral, and so abortion is immoral too. Fourth is to claim that a woman has a special moral obligation to the fetus because she is related to it, not so with the violinist. And finally is the possibility of just biting the bullet and saying that it would be immoral to separate ourselves from the violinist. Here are some possible responses to these objections. The first objection, that a pregnancy is natural while being hooked up to a violinist is unnatural life support. But what does being natural or unnatural have to do with morality? If you recall, this is the same response as the objection given against natural law theory. This is the naturalistic fallacy, and it is a fallacy, an error in reasoning, Being natural and being moral are two entirely separate issues or properties. The second objection, that of a difference of degree. Being hooked up to the violinist is somehow worse than being pregnant, so the analogy doesn't hold. But first of all, is this really true? Secondly, if this was the reason for objecting Thomson, then wouldn't it mean that abortions in cases where pregnancy is extra troublesome, say where the woman would have to stay in bed or where it would cause other physical or social damage, would be exceptions to the no abortion rule? Most importantly, one could easily modify the thought experiment with the violinist so that it's less troublesome, and then ask if one has a duty to stay hooked up. Maybe one is more mobile and has a long lead, so one doesn't have to stay hooked up in bed, for instance. Does this mean that one is now obligated to share one's organs with the violinist? Next up is the question of whether one conjoined twin should be able to separate himself or herself from the other if it means that the other will die. So the argument would claim that this separation is immoral, and so abortion is too. So the question to ask is this in fact immoral? One of the cases considered in Rachel's book was the Jody and Marie case. What were your intuitions regarding this case? Another important question to ask is whether or not such a case contains within it important moral differences. One thing Thomson rests a good deal of her argument on is the fact that the mother's body clearly belongs to the mother. In a conjoined twin case, it might not always be clear which twin a liver or lung belongs to. They are identical twins with the same DNA after all. The fourth possibility is the claim that the woman has a special moral duty to the fetus and not the violinist because she is related to the fetus and not the violinist. Can you think of a way to alter the thought experiment to test to see how well this works as a counterargument? Here is one way. We can simply rerun the thought experiment, but this time the violinist, we discover, is by chance related to the kidnapping victim. Maybe the kidnapping victim and the violinist were long lost brothers separated at birth, though they are effectively strangers now. Maybe the violinist was a sperm donor at a sperm bank, and the kidnapping victim was the result of in vitro fertilization. This is why they are such a great match and why the Music Lovers Society picked that person to kidnap. The question becomes now whether or not this changes your moral intuition. Not about whether or not it would be nice to save the violinist, or the amount of social pressure to do so, but about whether or not a person should be morally required to do so, and whether or not the law should require the kidnapping victim to stay hooked up. If it does, then this might be a good argument, but it also might imply that the law should force people to donate blood or bone marrow or organs to relatives even if they never met and do not want to as well. If it does not change your intuitions, then it is not clear that it is a difference that makes a difference. The fifth possibility being considered here is the possibility of simply biting the bullet and saying that it would be immoral to separate ourselves from the violinist. Of course, biting the bullet is always a possible response to any argument, but well, that about wraps up our presentation on Thomson's defense of abortion. Again, some of the tweets to the thought experiment were not in the paper. They were made by me to help explain her argument. It is also important to note that not every example Thomson did use was covered here, but my hope is that this helps you understand the other examples as well.